Man on Fire by A.J. Quinnell, the basis for the Denzel Washington action flick, and a book that really represents a great idea, unfortunately undermined by some really shoddy execution. So, one thing that I like to do sometimes is to read books that have been overshadowed by their film adaptations, such as Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park, David Morrell's First Blood. Last year, I read Brian Garfield's Death Wish, and that actually ended up being one of the best reads of that year for me. And I wanted to read this, Man on Fire, that little remembered thriller novel that has been the basis for not one, but two film adaptations, although one a whole lot better than the other, as I'm given to understand it. And you know what? This book was not very good at all. In fact, I was kind of shocked at just how bad and just how inept this book was and just how much it was bungled throughout the entirety of its execution. But if you don't know what Man on Fire is about, if you have not seen the Denzel Washington film, it is the story of Creasy. Whether that is his first name or his last name, we don't know, although in the film he is named John Creasy. In this book, he is only ever known as Creasy, and Creasy is an American expatriate, former French Foreign Legion soldier turned mercenary who is kind of washed up and more or less at the end of his rope. He's basically an alcoholic, and he has come to Italy to visit his former brother in arms, Guido, who proceeds to help set him up as a bodyguard serving a wealthy family by protecting their young daughter Pinta from the threat of kidnapping, because that was kind of a lucrative business back then, I guess, was to kidnap the children of wealthy families and then ransom them back for large sums of money. And as the relationship between this battle-scarred, world-weary and jaded man who is basically a shell of his former self, and this precocious though innocent young girl begins to blossom, he begins to kind of reawaken, kind of revitalize, kind of put down the bottle and starts to kind of remember who he used to be and try, kind of become the man that he was. He begins to kind of have a lust for life again thanks to this young girl. But sadly, Pinta is the victim of a kidnapping and she tragically dies. And now, in the wake of her death, this killing machine of a man who has now been brought back to life basically by her is now going to prove that there is nothing more dangerous than the man who has nothing left to lose, and he is going to kill his way to the top of the Italian mafia to avenge Pinta's death. And that's basically the premise of the book. The movie hews pretty closely to this setup, except it transplants it from Italy to Mexico, I think. But more or less, it correlates pretty well. But the premise of this book is its strongest feature. In fact, it is the only strong feature about this book, this premise, because there will always be a place for stories about cynical, embittered men who have seen the worst of the world being, kind of recalled to life by the innocence of a child. That kind of story will never get old. And this book plays into that, although unfortunately it drops the ball at basically every turn. And again, its basic idea is really the only really strong feature about it. So the writing in this book is not very good. It's not necessarily bad, but it's about as workmanlike as prose can possibly be. There is no real verve to the language, no vivacity, no real attempt at being anything other than the most basic conveyance of information possible. And this book really does demonstrate why it is so important to show and not tell, because this book is nothing but telling and no showing, and it suffers majorly as a result. So after Pinta is revealed to have been killed and Creasy is setting out on his one-man war against the mafia, he sits down with his friend Guido and he's telling him what he's about to do. And the way that he describes his feelings is really bad. And it's bad because he is describing his feelings. A.J. Quinnell apparently did not see fit to demonstrate his feelings to us, and so he just has them pour out of his own mouth and it's really clumsy. He basically just says, I loved Pinta, and now that she is dead, I am sad. But now my sadness has turned to rage, and I will kill the people responsible. Like, it's not quite on that level, but it's pretty damn close. It's really heavy handed, very artless, and again, it really does show why it's so important to show instead of tell. I think it would have been better served, the story would have, if A.J. Quinnell had instead shown us what Creasy is feeling by having him, cry or, break something, or, you can't go wrong with the single tear rolling down the cheek. And, in the story, Pinta gives him this little gold crucifix thing. And, you could have set up a pretty poignant scene of him like holding the crucifix and like clutching it in a death grip with the single tear running down his face. That would have been enough to kind of show to us how he's feeling. But no, you just put all his emotions into words and then just had them spew out of his mouth in the worst way possible. And the whole damn book is like that. Nothing is ever shown by implication. It's all just explicit exposition, just dumped out there in the dumbest manner imaginable. And again, the story suffers in a major way. Also, this story really suffers as well from the lack of any kind of villainous presence in the story. So, uh, the people responsible for the kidnapping in this book are just the mafia. It's just faceless mob goons that we had no introduction to prior to this inciting incident. So there's no real connection, and it's just kind of rote and mechanical when Creasy starts killing his way through these ranks of people that we know nothing about and don't really, have any investment in. It's just not set up very well, because in a story like this where you're going to have, when in a revenge thriller about a guy who's waging a one-man war against organized crime based on the death of a person that he dearly loved, you kind of want to have a central and overriding antagonistic force. And this book doesn't have that, because prior to the inciting incident, there's no mention of the mafia or anything. It only comes in after that, and again, there is no central villain. It's just a bunch of mob goons that he just blows his way through. And yeah, it's just not very engaging as a result. And there's no challenge. Like he never is in any danger, because he's just that much of a badass. He is basically a walking one man army, and it's just not very convincing, because he's never in any danger. He accomplishes every goal he sets out to accomplish with basically no resistance, and it's just not nearly as exciting as it should have been. As well, this book suffers from a remarkable overabundance of gratuitous sex, which is wholly unnecessary and really did bog this story down for me. I mean, it is kind of obscene the amount of sex that A.J. Quinnell just crams into this story. And I mean, I'm not a prude. I don't care if books have, explicit material in there as long as they need to. But this did not need that at all. I mean, it was just kind of absurd, the amount of sex scenes that are shoved into this. And as well, there's a scene in this book whenever Creasy goes to Pinta's school to watch her at a track meet. And the narration says how all the young girls who are like 12 come out in, shortcut running shorts. And it says they were developing wonderfully into young women, and Creasy looked on fondly at their bodies in their tiny running shorts. I'm like, hell yeah, dude, ogle those 12-year-olds like a real creep. I mean, it was just kind of tone deaf and weird to me that he was like, the 12-year-old girls were developing so nicely, and Creasy looked on at their thighs and their tiny running shorts. And I'm just like, this dude is supposed to be the hero, not some skeevy old pervert. But whatever. And also, this book has a really, really badly inserted element of romance. So, There's a romantic subplot in this when Creasy goes to this small island community to recover from the wounds he sustained during the kidnapping of Pinta and to train himself and to physically condition himself to be the soldier he once was. And there's a woman named Nadia who he falls in love with, again, in the most just heavy handed and exposition laden way possible. But Nadia is quite literally young enough to be his daughter, and I just didn't want to read that. First of all, it had no place in this story because this story needed to be as grim and hopeless as it could possibly be, because that is what the driving force of this book is. It is a man with nothing left to lose who does not care if he is killed in the process of carrying out this mission of his. He is going to do what he's going to do, and if he is killed in the process, so be it. That's what this book needed to be, but the insertion of this romance element undercut that. And plus, I don't want to read about a 50-year-old dude. I think he's like 49 in the book. I don't want to read about a 49-year-old guy having a gratuitously sexual romance, and I use that word very loosely, with a girl that's quite literally young enough to be his daughter. I just don't want to read about that. And it hurt the story so much because I knew what was going to happen. I knew it. I said he's going to live at the end of this book, and there's no reason why this character should live, because this is not the kind of story that has any kind of ending like that. Like, this guy is on a mission with a death wish, and that's the way it needs to be. But with this romance, um, it showed me that what AJ Quinnell was going to do with the end of this book, and of course he did it. He took the most chump way out. So at the end of the book, after killing his way through the ranks of the Italian mafia, Creasy is grievously wounded, and it ends, or you think it ends, on something of a cliffhanger with him. We don't know if he lived or died. We think he died, but then it has a very brief epilogue where it's like, oh no, he actually did live and he gets to go live happily ever after with Nadia. And I was like, hell no, you don't get to do that. This story was not that kind of story. This was supposed to be a grim and gritty story of one man staring death in the face and embracing it because he had nothing left to live for. And you chunked out and put this god awful romance into this book that undercut the whole premise, and the ending was such a bitch ass way to end this book that it dropped the rating majorly. In fact, to rate Man on Fire, I'm giving this book a D. The only reason it doesn't get an F is because the premise, the basic idea of the story, is actually really strong. It was just mishandled all the way through. Start to finish, this book was ineptly and clumsily executed, and yeah, the basic gist of it is the only thing I can defend. Now, comparing this to the Denzel Washington film, I think the movie is pretty clearly better than the film, and that's saying something because I don't consider that movie to be very good at all. I love Denzel Washington. He is one of my favorite actors. I think he's one of the greatest actors alive at the time, and I just basically have loved nearly all the movies that he's in. But I consider Man on Fire to be one of his weakest efforts because it's just such a rote and kind of just colored by numbers movie that never had the balls to be as violent or as graphic as it really needed to be. And um, it's also hideous to look at. I cannot stand watching that movie because of that thing that the camera does through the whole damn runtime. You know what I'm talking about if you've seen it, where it does that hyper exposure jump back and forth thing with the same image like replayed several times, the same little snippet. You know what I'm talking about if you've seen it. It does that thing through the whole freaking movie, and I just cannot bear to watch that movie as a result. Now, the ending to the movie, though, was superior to the book's ending because the movie actually ended as it needed to. Um, and the ending to the movie is really the only part of the movie that I can actually really defend. You know, whenever she runs up to him, if you've seen it, you know, and he says, "You're going home now," and then she says, "Where are you going?" And he says, "I'm going home too." That does hit hard and it cuts deep, and I like that. But the rest of that movie is just this forgettable, you know, bland revenge thriller that doesn't have any real distinguishing characteristics all that much from any number of others, but I still consider it better than the book because, again, the movie at least ended as it needed to be and at least had one touching moment, whereas the book was just bad. It's just bad. It is really a D level book, y'all. So, Man on Fire by A.J. Quinnell. Have you read Man on Fire? Have you seen the movie with Denzel Washington? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about the book slash movie, and or let me know whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything I've said about the book or the movie here today. If you haven't read Man on Fire, don't bother because this is a crap book. It is not a good thriller. And it's so frustrating because it could have been. That is the tragedy of this book. It had such a great foundation. The idea behind this book was really solid, but unfortunately, A.J. Quinnell was not the caliber of writer needed to pull it off well. And so what you get is a really bumbling book that just stumbles its way through what could have been a really compelling story, but alas was not. So, and as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to smash that like button like the Hulk and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, deuces.